So we have with us Octavio Gonzales and Emanuel Xavier, two writers, and you've read some of their work. And I think we'll start with maybe you can each introduce yourselves briefly and what you do. And then I know that Emanuel Xavier, that Manny has a set list he's going to perform and talk about, and he has to go a little bit earlier. And then we can have Q&A about writing, what it means to be Latino, Latinx in the United States. Sound all right? Wow, see, that's a question. And then questions usually don't like answers, right? There we go. You see? Yes, a resounding yes, or doc or something, right? Like, okay. All right. So Tavi and Manny, if you'd like to, and both of them are friends of mine. So, you know, be nice to them. They're very nice people. Yes. Okay. All right. So Tavi, do you want to go first, and then Manny, and then we'll go from there?
Sure. Thank you for having me. My name is Octavio Gonzales. I use he and elle pronouns. I go by Tavi. And I'm a college professor here in the States in the Boston area. I've been writing basically all my life. And I'm also a scholar of literary study. And primarily a poet, although I also write creative nonfiction, which is one of the pieces that you guys read for today. And I'm very happy to be here.
And my name is Emanuel Xavier, and I live in New York. I've been writing for several decades. My first book came out in 1997. My latest book came out in October. I work in publishing. I work for Penguin Random House, and thank you so much for having me. And yes, it's great to be here.
Yes. Okay. So I know that you have a set list. Do you want to maybe start with that then?
Yeah, sure. I mean, my plan, I mean, I'm working, so so I have a meeting at 10 that I have to run out to. But I was gonna read 4 poems, and then I was thinking maybe do a little Q&A and then read another couple of poems, and then does that work?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so.
Okay, so I'm just gonna kick it off. I don't know what you've read or what you haven't read, but I'm gonna read a couple of poems so you can get a feel for my poetry. This first one is called Americano, and I wrote it back in 2002, shortly after 9/11, and it's still pretty relevant. I look at myself in the mirror trying to figure out what makes me an American. I see Ecuador and Puerto Rico. I see brujo spirits moving across the backs of santeros, splatter with the red blood of sacrificed chickens on their virgin white clothes and blue beads for Yemaya, practicing religions without a roof. I see my own blood reddening the white sheets of a stranger, proud American blue jean labels on the side of the bed. I see Don Rosario and his guayabera sitting outside the bodega with his Puerto Rican flag, reading time in the eyes of alley cats. I see my mother trying to be more like Marilyn Monroe than Julia de Burgos. I see myself trying to be more like James Dean than Federico Garcia Lorca. I see Carlos Santana, Gloria Estefan, Ricky Martin, and Jennifer Lopez more than just sporadic Latin explosions, more like fireworks on El 4 de Julio, as American as Bruce Springsteen, Janis Joplin, Elvis Presley, and Aretha Franklin. I see Taco Bells and chicken fajitas at McDonald's. I see red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple. I see Cheetah Rivera on Broadway. You see, I am as American as lemon merengue pie, as American as Wonder Woman's panties, as American as Madonna's bra, as American as the Quinceañeros, the Abduls, the Lees, the Jacksons, the Kennedys, mostly all of us immigrants to this soil, since none sound American Indian to me, as American as television snow after the anthem is played, and I am not ashamed. Jose, can you see? I pledge allegiance to this country, 'tis of me, land of dreams and opportunity, land of proud detergent names and commercialism, land of corporations. If I can win gold medals at the Olympics, if I can sign my life away to die for the United States, ain't no small town hick gonna tell me I ain't an American, because I can speak in 2 languages. Coño carajo, y fuck you. This is my country too, where those who do not believe in freedom and diversity are the ones who need to get the hell out.
We
So,
can snap or applause.
if you want. Okay, so that poem was about being an American as a Latino growing up in the United States. This next poem is called Old Pro. It's from my latest book, and it's sort of like my history in literature. I wanted to be a poet. I hustled my way into the literary scene much like I had at the Piers. They watched me dare to speak my truth. They said, good for you, talking openly about your experiences as a queer poet of color and being sex positive. They felt what I was doing wasn't poetry. I heard them say I was only popular because I was a whore. I listened to them, gave them permission to use me, let them take pictures of me in my underwear to promote readings. They mispronounced my name and spelled it incorrectly and expected me to show up and perform for them, bring in the crowd. They slut-shamed me into a cage in a small dark room that smelled like piss. I wanted to be a poet. I wanted to escape my past as a prostitute. Maya Angelou had been a sex worker and become a poet. In bed, I wrote poems. I cuddled with cats. I thought what I was sharing was important. I thought what I was doing was significant. I thought poetry was meant for everyone. I made mistakes in my rebellion. I was almost killed. I believed Audre Lorde that my silence would not protect me. I wrote to be more like a Sado saint. I was inspired by homophobic contemporaries who hated me. I did not attend their workshops or teach alongside them in schools. I watched them become famous. I watched a new generation of poets pretend they did everything first. I watched them innovate and influence as I became invisible. Again, I used my first and middle name to be remembered. My last name belonged to a deadbeat dad. I tried to write about what I knew at a time when they did not care about houses or underground communities. DEI was not an acronym for diversity, equity, and inclusion, more like disenfranchise, exclude, and ignore. I read in front of large audiences and by myself to a phone camera. I thought I would reach my father this way someday. I thought I would meet the love of my life this way someday. Instead, we met the old school way at a seedy bar after marching against racism. He jokingly calls me Emanuel. He can recite the lines of my better known poems. He loves to tell stories. He knows there is only one M in my first name. We both learned the truth about my father, now know his name, where he lives in Florida. He lets me discuss my past. He lets me find the time to read and write. He is my literary award. I am his laureate. Thank you. So just a couple of more. This poem was called If Jesus Were Gay, and it was published from this same book from 2010. And it got me in some trouble because of the title, but after hearing the poem, you can make that decision yourself. If Jesus were gay, would you tattoo him to your body, hang him from your chest, pray to him and worship the Son of Man? Would you still praise him after dying for your sins? If it was revealed Jesus kissed another man, but not on the cheek, would you still beg him for forgiveness, ask him for miracles, hope your loved ones get to meet him in heaven? If Jesus were gay and still loved by God and Mary because he was their child after all, hailed by all angels and feared by demons, would you still long to be healed by him? Take him into your home and comfort him. Heal his wounds and break bread with him. Would wars be waged over religion? Would world leaders invoke his name for votes? Would churches everywhere rejoice and celebrate his life? Would rappers still thank him in their acceptance speeches? If the crown of thorns were placed on his head to mock him as the queen of the Jews, if he was whipped because fags are considered sadomasochistic sodomites, if he was crucified for the brotherhood of man, would you still repent? Would you pray to him when you were dying? If he didn't ask for you to be just like him, if he only wanted you to love yourself, if he asked that you not judge others, would you still wait for him to come back and save your soul? Would you deny him? Would you believe in peace? Would there still be hate? Would there still be hell? Would there be laws based on the meaning of true love? What would Jesus do? What would you do? And thank you. And this last poem in this set is a request from Richard, because he says you like this poem. Some of you, it's called The Thing About My Pussy. And I don't really read this often, but here it goes. My pussy has lots of dreams for us. There is no room for anyone else in our universe. We are atheists, but believe there will be an afterlife for us to continue this wondrous journey. My pussy is very political. When the time comes, my pussy has requested to be cremated, as the thought of long, slimy worms crawling inside sounds gross. My pussy chews on my pens as I try to write. My pussy does not realize he is acting in a way inappropriate to his age. My pussy refuses to grow up. Perhaps my pussy thinks it is Halloween, but then he is Black and every day is a satanic holiday to him. My pussy has money stored away somewhere in this apartment and a collection of thongs he wears in the summer when I am not home. I don't know where that rumor about pussies stealing your breath at night came from, but pussy's only goal is to get me to fall asleep so that we could cuddle. I have yet to find that hidden camera I know my pussy had installed to film me while having sex with men. One day, my pussy will blackmail me for some expensive Japanese dinner, or these will end up on the internet. My pussy is not satisfied that I gave him a drag queen name and had his balls removed at an early age so that he wouldn't have to tuck. My pussy has saved me on numerous occasions from villains and have broken into our home and attempted to murder me. He does not care that New York is not a stand-your-ground state. My pussy maintains his glorious physique by purposefully swallowing his own hair and does not understand his warped influence on young, impressionable girls insecure about their weight. My pussy is a great host and welcomes all of our guests with such flair. He loves corduroy and contemporary pop music. My pussy is a huge fan of graffiti art and period piece movies. My pussy likes poetry and humorous short stories, but has been known to read chick lit during the summer season. I would not put it past him to tag the neighborhood walls dressed as a character from a Jane Austen novel. My pussy is rather superstitious and hates the Pope, Republicans, onions, Jehovah's Witnesses, Chris Brown, and anyone allergic to pussy. Obviously, that was about my cat. So I thought at this point, if any of you have any questions about any of my poems or.
Now's your chance, y'all.
Anyone? You just want me to read poems?
Whether what happened to the parents, or what's left.
Can you hear Manny?
No, actually, I didn't. Did you repeat the question?
So it's about deliverance. Yeah.
What happened to the parents or caretakers?
Oh, okay. So I still have obviously it was Mother's Day yesterday. My mom lives in Ecuador in South America, and we have a nuanced relationship because, I mean, we're in a good place now, but it took a long time to get to that point. as far as my biological father, I just found out recently that he is alive and lives in Florida, but is from Ecuador. And he had married a Cuban woman and had 2 daughters and a son. I reached out to a cousin who lives in New Jersey and got that information, and I had tried to reach out to them, but they don't want anything to do with me, to my understanding. So basically I was a mistake. I was never meant to be. And, you know, I don't know if it's because I'm gay or for whatever reason, but it's totally fine because I still have my mom and that side of the family. So that's the answer to that. Okay, I'm gonna read a couple more poems.
Hold on. He did have a
Oh.
follow. Go ahead.
Oh, sure. Yes.
The microphone's here. It's hard to see here.
Because the question I had was prompted by the line of Padre, perdoname, for trying to kill off mommy and her boyfriend, pouring bleach into their soup, thinking maybe
Oh.
he her no more, maybe she won't beat me no more. Like,
Sure. Absolutely. So yeah, I'm actually, I don't know if I'm working on a memoir about my personal history and life growing up. In that poem, yes, I revealed that. You know, I was abused. My parents were very abused. My mom and her boyfriend were very abusive to one another. And you know, as a kid, I thought, you know, I could kill him off, you know, and but that didn't work. I ended up getting beaten for trying to poison them. But that was just me as a child. That was just one incident that happened that I'm glad I captured in that poem because it shows the pain and the anger that I experienced as a child. And so much so that, you know, I wanted to hurt them. And in turn, in life, I became self-destructive. I got really involved with drugs in my 20s and, you know, probably alcohol in my 30s. But I'm just grateful to still be here doing what I get to do, what I love to do.
yeah.
Okay. Do you have other questions for Manny?
I mean, what about the controversies about like if Jesus were gay and the cover of Jesus and the whole content? Was it like hard to face them or?
No, I think for me, I personally, I'm an atheist, but I have respect for all religions. It was more a question for myself, like, you know, you grow up I grew up in a very Catholic environment where, you know, I was told if you're gay, you go into hell and you're evil and you're demonized. And when I was, you know, obviously, like I said, when I was 16, I came out and I was kicked out. So I believed in all that and I sort of embraced my own darkness. But then I got to a point when it was like, no, I'm not a horrible person. I'm not a bad person. I love men, and that's not evil. That's not, you know. So in writing that poem, I was posing the question to my audience, in, you know, very simple terms, like, you know, like we don't know anything. Like none of us have ever met Jesus. All we know is like historical, or you know, from things that we read. So we, you know, we don't know what he was really like, and what if he was gay, or if he was black, or if he was, if he was any of these other things that are, that are oppressed these days, you know. So that was basically, I believe there was once a great, wonderful man named Jesus that walked this earth, did a lot of wonderful things for a lot of people, and you know.
Yeah.
Question about like how did you started performing? How did you how did you approach performing at the beginning? Because I imagine it couldn't be easy from the start to share such personal like information and feelings with others, especially with live audiences.
Absolutely. When I came onto the scene in like 1997, I was doing a lot of spoken word poetry, and spoken word poetry derived from hip hop, which was very homophobic. So there were a lot of rappers that would be competing in these slam competitions. And, then I would come up on the stage and read poems like Deliverance that were very personal. And, but my thought was, anyone who's in the audience who is appreciating poetry and appreciating art in any form should have some sort of an open mind. And I wasn't the only one that was doing it. There were a few of us, but it was definitely a challenge, because on the one hand, spoken word scene was still very homophobic, and on the other hand, the gay literary scene did not really embrace the spoken word poetry scene because they saw it as homophobic. So it was some of us that really pushed to try to bring these worlds together and say, no, it's about art, it's about creating, it's about keeping an open mind and speaking your truth and teaching each other about, our differences and our similarities. Like, that's to say, like, I may be gay and I may be Latino, and you might be Polish and white, but I'm sure we've shared similar experiences, because at the end of the day, we all want to be loved. We all want to be, respected and appreciated for our contributions, right? Yes. I couldn't hear the question.
About the poem Stepfather and how it felt like to take care of someone who used to be abusive to you.
It's funny because I was about to read that poem.
Ah.
Yeah, it was the one thing that I really learned in life personally, not just as a poet, but as a person, is about forgiveness, and trying to understand, what might have led people to be who they are. It's funny because I don't know if any of you have seen, we just went to see the play Wicked again on Broadway, and it's the backstory of the Wicked Witch of, and it was like, all right, so everybody has a backstory. Everybody has, there's a reason why people are who they are. And when I came to sort of try to understand that, and understand that in spite of everything, there were good things, I got to a place of forgiveness. And my mom's boyfriend, because they weren't married, who I called my stepfather, who he actually passed away a year ago today. Not today, but a year ago around this time. So, but yeah, I'd be happy. Do I have time to read a few more poems?
Yes, for sure.
Okay. How long is this class?
2 hours and 15.
Ah, gotcha. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna share a couple more poems. I'm gonna read Stepfather. He forgets that he used to call me mariconcito, that I harbored years of hatred toward him while hoping to find my real father. My childhood memories of him reminding me I was my mother's son, not his. I tried to poison him once and scattered sharp nails inside the shoes in his closet. By the time one of his sons died of AIDS, I was already lost in contempt for the man I blamed for everything. There was the time I was in love and he met my boyfriends. Now he forgets to go to the bathroom or where he is. I help him walk slowly outdoors to step outside the prison cell that is the tiny apartment with no windows in which I grew up abused by both of them. He barely understands. His fate has been torture. I know that I cannot be his savior. I used to pray for him to die, but here he is slowly fading. In his eyes, I see that he learned to love me and wishes he could take it all back. He is unable to recall those drunken nights and hateful words. I should do the same. I left a long time ago, but he still remains haunted by the little boy who wanted to belong. Like him, I want to forget that we made mistakes and caused so much pain. I need for both of us to remember how he taught me how to ride a bike or how to swim and told me, better late than never, that he loved me and was proud of all I had done. I have to help him settle into his favorite chair and let him know that I forgive him. There is a place somewhere where he will call me hijo, and I will know him as my dad. So thank you. I'm gonna lighten it up. When I started in spoken word poetry, I was writing a lot of poems in Spanglish, which is a fusion of Spanish and English. And this is one of my first poems. It's called Nueva York. While Mexicans shine the sole of the white man's shoes, Ricans and Dominicans drive around with black-faced virgins and saints on their dashboards, blasting rap and freestyle down the streets where mountain campesinos fall in love with South American cholas, getting cruised by the homeless men, loose change jingling in their pockets. And all the Latinos freezing their nalgas off, screaming, "Me cago en Dios!" while reminiscing about homelands where tropical trees and twilights warm their souls, and the sun brings out natural skin tones. Papito vendiendo coquitos, mientras brown skin project mothers cross themselves every morning before heading off to the factories or going out to do the compras so that the children won't have to eat pan con welfare cheese again. 16-year-old Angie popping her gum, hands on her cintura, screaming, "Yo, Miriam! Throw down the baby." But I don't want to go up the stairs. I'm too tired. Just throw the baby out the window. I'll catch him, I swear. The gringos watching curiously, lost in the translation, unable to understand the slang bodega terms, the Nuyorican words that give the spice of life, el ritmo y el sabor to la isla del encanto, la isla de Nueva York. Just two more, and then I'll do more QA. Richard requested that I read this poem. It is in response to the poem that I opened up with, Americano. After finding out that my real father was actually Ecuadorian and not Puerto Rican, I was forced to confront a new truth about myself and who I was. So I wrote this poem, which is very similar to that, but with, different text. I look at myself in the mirror, trying to figure out what makes me an American. I see Ecuador, but no longer Puerto Rico. I see indigenous spirits moving across the backs of Amerindians, Incas and Taínos splattered with the red blood of sacrificed chickens. I see the blood of a little brown boy, reddening the white sheets of supremacy, proudly soaking into the fabric of a world that does not want his existence. I see Don Augusto in his Panama hat made in Ecuador, sitting outside the kiosco with his Ecuadorian flag, reading time in the eyes of alley cats. I see now why my mother tried to be more like Marilyn Monroe, longing to be a blonde bombshell, an American dream, relating to an affair with a married man after getting pregnant by another engaged man that would abandon her. I see my cousin misguidedly convincing me about a Boricua father as I long to be like Federico Garcia Lorca. I still see Carlos Santana, Gloria Estefan, Ricky Martin, Jennifer Lopez, and Christina Aguilera. I see my father enjoying the fireworks on El 4 de Julio somewhere in Florida, not Puerto Rico. A war veteran with 2 daughters and a son. Myself, just a sporadic Latin explosion. I see yapingachos and ceviche de camarón. I see yellow, blue, red, and orange, green, purple. I see guayasamín paintings on my wall. You see, I may no longer be as Puerto Rican as arroz con dulce, as Puerto Rican as J-Lo's panties, as Puerto Rican as Iris Chacon's bra, but I am still as American as the Quinteñeros, the Granjas, the Rodriguezes, the Cruzes, the Delgados, all of us immigrants to the soil, since none sound Amerindian to me. Jose, can you see? I pledge allegiance to this country, 'tis of me, land where Latinx mixed, land of Latin kings and queens and everyone in between, land where that was gentrified like my mother, land of Spanish names and racism. If I can discover my heritage after 5 decades, if my father can abandon me as a baby to die in the United States, ain't no small town hick or patriota gonna tell me to go back to my country, wherever that is, because I can still speak in 2 languages, coño carajo y fuck you, and still say chévere and huepa. This is my blood that runs deep. This is my freedom and diversity. This is my truth, and I will never get the hell out. So you see how I took that original poem and I sort of remixed it into this one. And the last poem that I'm going to read is LatinX's, and it's from the new book. And I don't know how familiar any of you are with the term Latinx, but before that we used to say Latino or Latina, and now there's Latin. There's always different ways of naming our culture. So I wrote this poem and I'll share it. How's everybody doing, first of all? You all good? Okay. Latinx is something between Latino and Latina, reclaiming how we had defined hombres sitting in front of lit mirrors with a table full of cosmetics and mujeres with skin fades and ace bandaged down breasts. Something like drag queens a la escuelita and butches a café con leche, like a cool tío that teaches you how to death drop and titi with a mustache. Something like your primo that mysteriously disappeared from the family and is never spoken about. Somewhere between when did you come into this country and brown babies in hospital delivery rooms, growing up in a country where we are told to go back to wherever we came from. Somewhere between being oppressed by whitewashed politicians that come from families that look like us and our bodies outlined with white chalk on sidewalks when we are killed, check boxes without nuance. Something between J-Lo and Jenny from the Block, Rita Hayworth and Rita Moreno, migrating across rivers and spending all your money on airfare. Something between Vaporub and Brujeria, appreciating art by Goya and Trump-loving Goya products from Spain. Taco Tuesdays and the waitstaff and cooks at Italian restaurants. Children in cages and kids bused to school where they are called spics. Teens turning to gangs for brotherhood, sisterhood, and in the hood, maricones getting gay bashed. Alcoholism and Corona, tequila, margaritas, mezcal. Something somewhere between a quinceañera and a sweet 16, celebrating Cinco de Mayo and clutching your purse as brown boys walk by. Fetishizing Latin lovers and sex trafficking girls who speak Spanish. Getting displaced by gentrification and they're taking over our neighborhoods. Somewhere between desirable and undesirable, being unwanted no matter what letter closes us out, an O, an A, an X, an E. Somewhere between Vanna White and wanna buy a vowel. Somewhere between your English is so good and speaking Spanglish. Somewhere between the right to live the American dream and being a welfare queen. Somewhere between gracias to the academy and filling up our prisons. Somewhere between el pueblo unido jamás será vencido. And we're here, we're queer, get used to it. Somewhere between Dia de los Muertos and painting your face white to symbolize death. Somewhere between you have the right to remain silent and silence equals death. Somewhere between telenovelas and the new One Day at a Time. Somewhere between Richie Valens and Cardi B. Gender fluid like White Mercado and Demi Lovato. Somewhere between Lady Bunny's favorite snacks and Bad Bunny. Something like, we were here on this land first and X marks the damn spot. Okay, that's it. That's all the poetry I got for you. So now it's Q&A.
If you have more questions for Manny. Yes.
Could you expand a little bit more about your father? And I'm also interested, what work is he veteran?
What was the question?
Can you repeat it?
Could you expand more about your father? And I'm also interested, what war is he veteran of?
Which war is he a veteran of?
Oh, so I found out that my biological father was a veteran of the Korean War, which would have been nice to know growing up, at the very least. You know, because if somebody was telling me to go back to my country or whatever, I could have had that as a defense as well.
Other questions? So Manny, how does it feel moving from being sort of very much on the outside, both from hip hop and from the gay literary scene when you started, to now hosting the award ceremonies, which you did, what, last month, I think?
Yes. It's, I feel very privileged to have this opportunity because a lot of people that were my contemporaries aren't here to have this moment. And also because I never had, you know, the opportunities to have a formal education in literature, you know, to be able to study that in college or a university. And, you know, when I started off, it was very difficult for me because I was dubbed the street poet, you know, and I wasn't taken seriously because, you know, how does a former prostitute become a poet? Like, who the hell do you think you are? But I took inspiration in a lot of the books that I read and a lot of the reading that I did. And, you know, eventually I was able to take some workshops and you know, learn my craft and become better at it. And to be in this place now where, you know, I'm part of the publishing triangle and I could host the award ceremony and, you know, I could be a finalist for Orlando Literary Award and all that. You know, it's that much more meaningful and special because, you know, the odds were always against me. You know, by all means and accounts, I was never supposed to be here, you know, talking to a class in Poland about my poetry, you know. So.
Other questions for Manny? Yeah.
A question like about your creative process. Is it more so that things just come to you and then you kind of try to put them like into for them to make sense, to be like on topic, or do you have sometimes a topic in mind and try to write on that topic?
I think I get a lot of inspiration from, you know, perhaps from reading, and I also draw a lot to my personal history. I feel like I had a very unique experience, and I try to give voice to that because a lot of people that were in that same community and that same scene perhaps didn't. And for me, it was very healing. So when I decide I'm going to write a poem, it's about something that I want to express, that I want to let out, that, you know, that maybe I, you know, like for example, like in the new book, I wrote a poem about, you know, a rape incident that I experienced. It's called Into the Woods. And I had never really confronted that, and I had never really opened up about that. And I found a way to do it, you know, I that just kind of happened. And you know, and other times, you know, I feel very strongly about something politically or whatever, and I need to, for example, like Americano, or If Jesus Were Gay, and I want to challenge my readers or my audience to think about something, to consider something that perhaps they didn't before. So, you know, because I think it was James Baldwin who said that as artists, we push boundaries, or we're here to create change, or something like that. But that's kind of the philosophy that I kind of personally came from as a writer. You know, because there's different types of poetry. Some people write about nature and birds, and I mean, there's very different types of poetry. But for me, this was what worked for me, where I found my place.
We have time for one last question before he has to go and do real work.
So I have a more general question, because Americana and the last two poems that you have read, to me they sound like a message of encouragement to Latinx community. And my question is, what do you think is your main audience? Is it Latinx community or all Americans?
I think it just for everyone. Poetry, that's where I came from. You know, when I first, I was so resistant to poetry in the beginning because, you know, in high school, you know, we're taught like, you know, the classics like Shakespeare and so on. And, you know, it wasn't until I discovered spoken word for myself that I realized, you know, poetry is not all about rhyming or metaphors. You know, it can be about, there's, like I said, there's different types of poetry. So when I started writing, I think it was just simply to share my own personal experiences, and I thought I knew my audience. But then I would go out and read in front of large audiences, and I'd have like an older white woman come up to me and tell me, you know, that she enjoyed my poetry and can relate because, you know, maybe something happened to her in her life that was very similar to mine. And that really touched me because it was kind of like, okay, so my audience is not, you know, you think that it's very specific, but it could be universal. Because like I said, we all share those, we're all looking to be loved, we're all looking to be accepted, we're all looking to fit in. So even if, like, for example, like if you don't personally, if you don't relate to my poetry, you know, growing up Latino and gay in the United States, you know, there might be something in the poem that's kind of like, oh, I know where he's coming from. I understand how he feels, or I've been in that place before. So I think my audience is just anyone. Hopefully, it's universal. So,
You feel identified with his poetry? Did you feel identified with his poetry?
I think I can relate.
Mhm. Okay. Well, that's all we've got time for with Manny. So how about a thank you to Emanuel Xavier for.
thank you, and I'm so sorry that I'm gonna miss you, Tavi. But you know, this is being recorded, so hopefully I'll get the recording of this and I can see the whole thing. But
Nice to see you.
yeah, so great to see you
Congratulations,
too.
by the way.
Thank you.
Your work is amazing.
Thank you. And I look forward to hearing you. So bye, everyone. Thank you.
So Tavi, maybe as a segue, I'm interested in what you think about the whole Latinx and Latina and all of that. If you want to talk about that, you don't have to, but
Sure. Can we take a step back though and do introductions first?
Yes, absolutely.
Yay.
So what do you want to be introduced as?
Just your name and why you're taking this class. How about that?
Who wants to start? There's a lot of them now. We start off small, but
That's
there's
good.
a lot of them. Well, there's several Alexandras, right? So we can knock out 3 of you, at least with Alexandra. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I'm Jan, and I was mainly interested in broadening my horizons, and this class was way more interesting than the other options.
So I can go next. My name is Michał, and I'm here basically because it was the only class talking about Latino history, and I was interested in it.
Mhm. Turns out there's a big gap in Latino literature and studies here at American Studies Center. So
So I can go next. My name is Karol, and I took this class because I don't like choosing classes that are concentrated solely on the United States. So I prefer classes like I took previously American Jewishness, for example, and I thought that this one was really interesting. That's why I joined it.
oh, come on, don't be shy.
Yeah, I'm Claudia. I'm actually from Germany, but and the reason why I chose this class is because in Germany we don't talk about Latinos in our studies. Yeah, and here I have now the opportunity to do it, and I'm excited to hear about it more.
So my name is Matilda, and I think I'm here for the same reason as everyone else. Like we just don't really learn much about Latinos in the US. So
So my name is Zasha, and I think that like this was an area that I was like lacking because I'm doing my last semester now, and I feel like other stuff I more or less covered during those 3 years, and this is something that like, of course, I got something on, but for sure I had a feeling that it's not enough to like be able to talk about it.
Mhm. And we only do it in 5 weeks. So.
Yeah, but twice per week.
But twice a week, yes.
So my name is Gabriela, and I kind of, all of us, I believe, have pretty much the same reason to come here, which is like there were not many classes about Latinos in here, so that's why I'm here, because I learned about religion, natives, literature, and so on, but not Latinos.
So my name is Suja, and same reason, like something new to learn, and yeah, just something different, new knowledge. Not everything is centered on Black Americans in the US, as kind of our studies cover mostly this part. So yeah, something new to find out and be able to talk about later. My name is Olga, and I chose this class because I was interested in gaining some perspective on like the history and culture of Latinos in the past, because they are very like present in contemporary culture, but we didn't learn much about where it all came from.
Apparently the rest are too shy to tell you who they are, but I think you see a pattern here.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, it's great to be here. And I think it's an interesting commentary on what counts as American. I think Emanuel Xavier's poetry really addresses that gap. But I also want to say that, you know, I wouldn't consider myself representative of the Latino Latinx community, because I don't think anyone is. It's such a diverse community. And I think Latino, Latinx, Latine, all of these terms are fairly new and American. And if you talk to anyone who's born in their original country, like myself being Dominican, my identity culturally is Dominican, right? And I think the Latino identity is much more of a US based compromise. But even if you talk to someone who say who's Puerto Rican, who's Chicano, these are all very different, right? And so it's really an umbrella term that is a very contested term, which is where I think the question about what I think about Latinx, I think it's a funny question. It's a funny term, but I think it's an important debate. And not everyone subscribes to that. I think it's generally a generational thing where a lot of older, we used to call ourselves Hispanics. A lot of older Hispanics and Latinos really do not identify with Latinx, partly because it's not a Spanish term, right? Latinx is not something that you say in Spanish, whereas Latino, Latin America is a Spanish-derived term, where Latinx is a very US term. And I think it alienates a lot of older Latinos because it is an English-based concept, right? And so one of the generational distinctions across this vast umbrella term is the relationship to English versus Spanish, right? And I think Emanuel Xavier talked about his relationship to Spanglish. I speak in Spanglish. I write in Spanglish, but mostly in English. And I think he and I are kind of generational crossovers where our childhoods were defined by Spanish in many ways, but our adulthoods defined by English. So that kind of bilingual, bicultural experience is definitive of what you might call the Latinx experience. But as the generations continue, English becomes the dominant language. And that is seen as, again, a division across generations. And it's a very contested division. We had a poet here. I teach at Wellesley College, and we had a very incredible Latina poet, Elizabeth Acevedo. Her book, The Poet X, is a National Book Critics Circle Award or National Book Award winner. It's a wonderful book. It's a novel written in poems by the protagonist in the first person. And she was asked why she doesn't write in Spanish, right? So her book is in English and in Spanglish. And she said she doesn't think in Spanish. She doesn't dream in Spanish. She dreams in English. She speaks in English. She thinks in English. And so she writes it in English, and then she has a wonderful translator who translates it into the Spanish. And she's much younger than Emmanuel or myself are. And so I think that's, again, the question of Latinx is a question about which language will define this community, whether it be English or Spanish. And I believe the future is in English, and for whatever it's worth. So, but it's a real fault line. I think, again, in some ways, she was being called out by a Spanish teacher, no less, in the audience asking, why don't you write in Spanish, right? As if her writing in English first is a choice that, decenters Latin American identity and centers an Anglo Latin American identity. And that's quite an interesting debate.
Do you think that expectation of language comes from outside the community more than from within the community?
No, I think it's all of the above. I think, it's how we negotiate. We're a very interesting community. Many of you may know that 40% of Latinos voted for Donald Trump. It's a very conservative, it can be very conservative. And there's also a very interesting and contested relationship to Blackness in the Latino community. And so in terms of the historical arc, one of you asked about the history of the Latino American community in the US, is an arc generally moving towards either whiteness or blackness. And that has not been resolved yet, right? And I think that is one of the another question, right? Are we brown? Are we black? Are we white? Right? And in some ways, that is not an answerable question because Latinos can be of any race, but I mean more in terms of cultural affinity and cultural loyalty. And I feel like the United States is defined by the black and white binary, and Latinos don't fit easily within that binary, right? We're on a spectrum. And so is Latin America, right? But in the US, it's a binary. And so it becomes a question of, are you with us or against us? And I think in terms of the American dream is defined by its proximity to whiteness as well as to middle classness, right? And so I think a lot of Latinos want the American dream, at least for their children, and success in the US is defined by bourgeois whiteness, right? And I think it's a real struggle for some of us who are more progressive and radical to embrace our blackness and to really be able to live with the contradictions of wanting to have, you know, the good American life and also, you know, stand for social justice and for racial equality.
This brings up something interesting. I don't mean to dominate this, but until they start talking to you, I'm going to talk to you. But because it brings up something interesting that happens at Canisius, where Hispanic or Latino, whatever term we're currently using at the moment, is subsumed under blackness, and I wonder if that's similar to what happens at Wellesley. I don't know what your population of Wellesley is, but
right. So most of Wellesley's Latino students are from California, which again is a Chicano-centered. And Chicano identity has its own history, right, including its own radical history and radical politics from the 60s. But I think it really depends, right? I think, again, it's even broader than Latinos in the US. For example, we have a lot of East Asian students, and those students, some of whom are international. So they're coming from Hong Kong, they're coming from Taiwan, they're coming from China. A lot of them are also kind of confused by the American racial binary. And again, I think culturally, this nation asks you to choose, are you with us or are you with them? And the us and them are defined by white and black. And so it's a real contradiction because obviously proximity to whiteness defines in some ways objective success. But culturally and in terms of, you know, political and social justice, proximity to whiteness is in some ways a betrayal of your identity or your cultural affinity. But in some ways, you're being asked to choose one or the other. So it's a really tough question, but it's a fairly individual negotiation. And I think, again, some Latinos, for example, Cuban Americans historically are very conservative and they're very white-centered, mainly because the Cuban emigres, the Cuban exiles, were mainly from the upper middle class. So they were already racially very white, right? Whereas a lot of, say, New Yorkers who were born or who are from New York City are basically in the melting pot of black and brown New York, right? And that's a very different orientation than some of the wealthier Florida Cubans. And so it really depends on your class as well as your family's nation of origin in terms of your political allegiances. Can you all hear me okay?
Oh yeah, yeah. Do you hear us?
Yes.
Do you want to read something? I know we didn't talk about this actually.
We didn't, no. And actually, I don't feel like reading, to be honest. I'd rather just have a conversation if you don't mind.
Yeah, that's fine. I just wanted to give you the opportunities. So questions from you all.
Questions or comments? Sometimes I feel like sometimes students are bombarded with needing to formulate their comments as questions. So just, I guess, comments. If you don't have questions, I'm really open to where you want to go in this conversation.
Nobody.
I may ask if you maybe sometimes feel frustration about writing in English, that maybe you would prefer to use exclusively Spanish, but you know that that would like limit your, you know, sphere which you can reach.
That's an excellent question. What was your name again?
Zosha.
Zosha? Yes, that's a really insightful question. Because it is very much a divide, right? If you write in Spanish, for example, if I wrote in Spanish, I'd be mostly having a Dominican audience from the island, right? Whereas if I write in English, it is mostly not a Dominican audience, it's mostly an American Latino audience. And so again, it's a real kind of binary choice, right? Are you with us or are you with them? And there's really no real compromise except for the Spanglish, which a lot of us use, right? But that Spanglish itself is oriented towards the US, the Anglo-North. And again, I think that becomes more and more common. I've had students in my classes who don't speak Spanish, who are Latino, right? Because there are multiple generations. And so in some ways, it's a problem that will be resolved by itself as generations continue and as the Latinos become integrated linguistically. And I think that process is ongoing. And so to choose Spanish, I think, would be in some ways to not just to limit one's audience, but also to choose an older non-American formation as your center. And so in some ways, we're forced to be bilingual and we're forced to write in English, or at least be translated into English if you want to have a broad audience, right? And I guess personally, for me, the frustration goes both ways. I write more powerfully in English, and my Spanish is not as strong, partly because of where I live and how I work and what I study and what I teach. But it's also frustrating not to be able to access the Spanish. But again, it's almost like you want to write with both hands in a different language in each hand. And some of us do it really well. Like I think Emanuel Xavier does it really well. I tend to focus more on the gaps between the English and the Spanish. And so I think about that as a theme more than I think about, whether I want to, write more in English or in Spanish. So again, I think generationally that question will be resolved. And that really divides, Latinos in the US from all other Latinos in the world. And that's a really big gap at this point, and it's only getting bigger because of the dominance of English and the predominance of English in publishing.
So I have a question because I was like Googling you now, and it says that you're a specialist in like queer literary studies. And like, is there anything, is it like general, or are you focusing on it like among like Latinos and Latin people in general?
In terms of my study of queer literature, it is mostly transatlantic. So I study mostly the 20th century. And so I basically work in American and British queer literature. So actually, I don't really talk about Latino queer literature except for the very few examples that exist, including Xavier. But there's actually precious few, unfortunately. So if I were to study queer Latino literature, it would be a fairly small canon at this point, partly because of what Emanuel Xavier was saying earlier, that it's a fairly heteronormative cultural tradition, right? Whereas the queer tradition itself is minor, but it's long, right? I mean, you can go back to Oscar Wilde, you can go back even earlier, right? And so there's a very rich queer literary tradition that I think in some ways spans multiple languages. I think it'd be foolish in some ways to limit it to only one ethnic identity, right? Queerness in some ways is global, right? If you think about my night with Garcia Lorca, right? There's all kinds of transcultural, transnational queer exchanges, right? The French that went to Algeria, like André Gide, Jean Genet, right? So there's, in some ways, queer literature is a transnational historical formation, and that's what I really study in its modern instantiation, so from the late 19th century to the present. So that's really, really fun. Where I teach, half the students identify as non-binary or queer. And so it's quite interesting to teach students who themselves identify as being part of the LGBTQ community. And I think ethnicity is a wonderful ingredient to throw into the mix, but I think queer identity is so specific that it actually has developed its own literary history, its own heritage, which again crosses all races and all ethnicities. I think I have students from every part of the planet that take my classes.
I actually had a question as a kind of follow-up to the previous two ones. What do you think of the tension on for writers to try to tone down a little bit of the queerness, the heritage, the ancestry elements for a more global audience? Like, how do you feel about trying to I forgot the word that I wanted to use, but just lower the queerness or tradition, but not tradition, but the heritage of the elements.
So is the question about whether to tone down the queer content to be more mainstream?
Yeah, to be more mainstream and more marketable. Like, how does it?
Yeah.
What's the tension there?
No, that's a great question, right? Both Emanuel Xavier and myself are published by a very, very, very small independent press, right? Whereas Elizabeth Azevedo, who is not a queer writer, but she's a Latina writer, is published by Penguin, right? And she literally won the National Book Award. And it's not a coincidence that she doesn't write about queer centered topics, right? That book, which is one of many that she has, she's very prolific. She has one of the characters is gay. The protagonist's younger brother is gay, and so there's a gesture towards that kind of gender sexual inclusion, but it's a token gesture. I'm not saying that that's what she's doing. I'm saying that is what the marketplace expects queerness to be, right? Kind of like to the side of the main narrative. And I think as a cultural outsider, right, as a Latinx writer, you kind of do have to be really careful about being too hyphenated, having too many intersectional identities, because that will be seen as too niche and not speaking to a broader audience. So in other words, if you're Latino already, to put in queer would mean limiting your audience in like a
Latino
lot. I'm sorry?
To limit it to Latino queers, to the intersection of the two.
Yes, and in some ways that means limiting it away from Latino readership completely, because queerness is so taboo, and it's in some ways in many Latino communities you don't speak about it, much less write about it. So it's not something that you would. I'm sorry?
Yeah.
I said that it's a Venn diagram where you just have a tiny slit between the two circles.
It does seem like that, doesn't it? I think the other side to this are the cultural tropes that you're meant to wield as a culturally inflected writer, right? And I think, for example, I don't think I do that very well, to be honest. I don't use the tropes that American audiences would expect me to use. And I think that's in some ways a limiting factor as well. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you are a culturally niche writer, you are meant to exhibit that nicheness in ways that are culturally understandable by a mainstream audience. I think, for example, Emanuel Xavier does that really well. And I don't think I do that as well because it's not really what I'm trying to do, but it is what the marketplace expects you to do. A really great example is Ocean Vuong. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Ocean Vuong, his work. He's really excellent. He's a Vietnamese American poet and novelist now. And he's able to wield that intersectional identity, right? Being queer, being Vietnamese, being a refugee, right? Being a migrant in ways that are really culturally understandable by as broad an audience as possible, while still being authentic to his cultural heritage and his cultural self. And that I think is, again, very, very tight, a very tight rope to walk on. And very few of us can do that, right? Without betraying one side or the other.
Thank you.
I have a question because you said that being queer is something taboo in Latino community. And do you see any perspective to change that, or is it just going to be like that?
It's a good question because it is also part of that evolution that I mentioned before, right? And it's not just about moving towards a more American-centered, English-dominant culture. It's also a more inclusive, a more gender and sexually inclusive Latino culture. And that's what LatinX is, by the way. LatinX is, the X is to neutralize the gendered terms Latino, Latina, because, and yet Spanish is a gendered language, right? And so that's kind of, in that very X, you have the symbol of that rise toward inclusion, right? To including non-binary Latinos and trans Latinos, and by extension, queer Latinos. But again, that is a fairly niche identity category. I think, Richard, you might be able to inform us about this, but I think self-identified Latinx is like 2.4% of the American Latino population that identifies with that label. It's mostly a label of academics.
Yeah, actually, we talked about that last week, that it's primarily an academic thing, and it has no relevance outside of US academia, I feel. Yeah, it's very specific.
Yeah, which again speaks to the conservatism of having much more traditional gender roles and gender identities, as well as more traditional sexual identities and sexual roles that derive from that. There's also the other case, which is sexuality as an identity is a very Western / Anglo-American construct, right? So if you think about other ways of organizing your sexuality, you can think about passive and active, activo pasivo, which is one way that a lot of Latino men define their role, as opposed to being gay or straight. They're either active or passive, which in some ways doesn't compute with the focus on sexuality as an identity that the American concept of sexuality holds. And so in that sense, being gay is doesn't really make any sense from a certain standard point of view, right? Having sex with other people of the same gender is something that you do, not something that you are, much less something that you identify as a cultural heritage, right? And that, I think, is a majority of Latinos. Does that make sense? I'm not sure if I'm moving really quickly or speaking in generalizations, but
It's fine.
And we'll talk about that more later in the semester, this very fast 5-week semester.
Yeah.
So actually, Tavi, we need to actually say goodbye at this point. But shall we thank him for joining us? And
yeah, nice to meet you all, and thank you for inviting me. Have a
and
good class.
Yeah, thank you, Tavi, and we'll talk again soon.
Bye.
That was letting him in, right? The blue thing. Okay.